Fantastic, guys. It is 1 o'clock Eastern time, and we are going to kick off. So happy Thursday, and welcome everyone to Crisis Triaging 101 for international educators. Hope you've all taken the opportunity to introduce yourself using the chat box. And just a note, we do hope that everyone will publicly engage. You guys are all a very important part of this conversation. But if you do choose to privately engage, you have comments or questions that you wish to remain anonymous, please note that you can send private messages. Please do so directly to me as the host. My name is Tracy Snowden. I am the CEO and founder of Apto Global. Apto Global is a two-way social learning platform which helps internationals everywhere to adapt to local communities and environments anywhere. And one of the core personas we serve is the international student and the international education and cross-cultural exchange ecosystem. So I'd like to take this opportunity to now introduce our very, very special guests and conversation starters. Please meet Tania Novice. Tania, if you can just wave in the screen. You can also see her lovely picture here as well. Tania is the director of the Ralph Bunche International Affairs Center at Howard University. One of the things that really impresses me about Tania is her passion for international education. She specifically attended Macalester in St. Paul, Minnesota, just for that reason. And she really shows a strong passion for duty of care and student services. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Wilkerson. Dr. John Wilkerson is the Assistant Vice President for International Services and the Executive Director of International Admissions at Indiana University, go Hoosiers. So Dr. John is, I think the thing that impresses me is he's like a walking encyclopedia of facts and knowledge. And when we had some early discussions, had incredible critical insights into fiscal modeling and strategic foresight. So hopefully he'll be sharing some of those with us today. I also want to give a special shout out to Erin England, who is communications care lead at Apto Global, for organizing everything administratively and operationally. You have her to thank for everything leading up to the webinar today. A little bit about the format. For the first 40 minutes, please stay muted. If everyone could mute themselves now, other than myself and the two panelists, that would be appreciated. After that point, we are going to engage in some active Q&A discussions, but we do encourage you to actively participate with questions and comments in the chat box right now and throughout the course of the webinar. We also will be entering polling questions as we move through topic by topic, so please participate in those. They are anonymous polling questions and will allow us all to walk away with an interesting data set from today's webinar. Okay, so why are we here? You can see here on the screen some recent headlines. I think we're all very well aware and have probably been actively reading some of these and actively feeling some of them. And I hope we've all had the opportunity to commiserate with an empathetic listener over the course of this time, at least one. And so the purpose of today, as we move forward, though, is less about focusing on the past and more about focusing on the future. And I'd like to take a look at some of the results of the entrance poll that you all took when you registered. As you can see, most of you cited that international innovation and figuring out what to do in a world without mobility was the #1 interest, but a close second was successful international education in general. We are going to be covering these top 4 topics today. If any of you have urgent needs around fiscal modeling or lingering urgent care, we're going to have an opportunity at the end of this webinar to do some give-get in the chat box, where people will be able to share links, resources, ideas. And Apto Global is going to be combining all of that information in the material. Anything that is website link appropriate, we will backlink on our COVID resources page for international educators. Anything that is more tangible, we're providing to you in a tangible asset. So please feel free to take advantage of that as well. All right. Aaron, can you kick us off with topic number one, please? All right, great. And if you can provide the polling question for us, for our participants. All right, the polling question you can see in the chat box. I believe that in order for international education programs to succeed in a post-COVID era, they must be able to integrate both offline and online innovation. So you've got 5 minutes to answer that question and submit at your leisure. And while we do that, Tania, I am going to tee up a question for you. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Drum roll, please. All right. So, Tania, given your background in international education and your experience organizing successful partnerships and study abroad programs globally, how did you broadly define successful international education, and how has that changed in a COVID area? What do you think that looks like now, given the lack of mobility?
Thanks. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. This is a conversation that I'm always looking to have with anyone who will listen. So thanks for having me. Successful international education. I think for many of us, and I've seen some of the people who are on the call, I think for many of us, a successful international education has always included some form of student mobility. I don't think that it is the only way. It's not the only way, but I think that we have, for the last little while at least, always had some conversation about international education that included students traveling from one place to another across borders. But but that is not how I think it's going to be defined moving forward. I think that we should we should also always remember that even in the conversations of students moving across borders, there have always been those students who have been unable to do that for a variety of reasons, whether it be financial or the courses that they needed were not offered, what have you. There has always been a reason why that has not been accessible to everyone. Now it's not accessible to almost anyone, and so we have to do a better job of bringing the world to our students here while they are not able to go elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in this COVID situation, we're all hopefully looking for silver linings, and that topic that you brought up or that you touched upon, Tania, about diversity and inclusion and equity, I think there is a silver lining here in that in some ways this may level a playing field for a lot of people if we can provide some inexpensive alternatives. And maybe that's something that will continue on even as mobility starts to pick back up. That's the hope. Great. Thank you, Tania. Dr. John, you have tremendous understanding of what it takes to successfully recruit and enroll international students and the fiscal impact thereof. How have those KPIs changed, and how do you think they will continue to evolve in a post-COVID world?
Oh, tremendous understanding is a lot to live up to, especially right now. I think that is a great question. At its core, it almost becomes an institutional imperative, almost an existential question, actually, in terms of international education, because I think the underlying question that universities, partner organizations have to ask themselves is, what is the importance of international engagement? What's the value add in terms of learning communities for the presence of international students, international voices? Pardon me. And also defining international as no longer having to do with passport color, but rather having to do with experience. And I think um, to to that point, the opportunities that potentially exist here are to move the needle a little bit further than maybe we've been able to within the field towards truly internationalizing curriculum and internationalizing global engagement. One thing that's been encouraging in that respect to watch is kind of this forced innovation within the academy in particular, um, within the institutions. And that's not to say that the academy has not been innovators in this space, but I think that that kind of perpetual gap between administration and the academy has been a little bit bridged out of necessity through this. And through that process, it's been interesting to see the proposals that have come forth in terms of collaborative learning with partner institutions, utilizing in-country presence of global offices at universities in new ways to probably more literally than ever actually meet the student where they are. And that's viewing, I think, in to your question, international education still a little bit through that export lens. But the end result, I think, is potentially the same, that the classroom experience, that the opportunities to engage with diverse communities, diverse in many definitions, is hopefully enhanced through some of these innovative processes. So answering the question in terms of KPI, I really think comes down to institutional imperatives and how they answer that question of what is the value add. And I could go on and on about survey data and so forth that indicates what that value add is and how that meets the expectations of both domestic and international students. But I'll refrain for a moment.
Well, I mean, I think that existential question, and thinking about, and part of the topic of this webinar is balancing, that duty of care, that student experience, great education, along with the realities of what's happening from a fiscal level. And, there may be some of us on this call who I was reading the article, one of the headlines, from Chronicle of Higher Education today, and seeing the disparity in in terms of international educators, some who are just worried about keeping their job, and others who are concerned about health. I think that disparity likely exists simply because of the financial security or lack thereof, right? So, a lot of us probably have an added challenge of gaining buy-in, or simply showing the relevance and the importance of being able to demonstrate that buy-in. So, John, I'm gonna ask that we follow up with you for some assets and some research and data that we can provide to some of our attendees related to that, to help to build that buy-in and to help define the importance of the program. Why do they, why does it need to exist in the first place? Very, very good. Thank you. Aaron, can we take a look at those poll results again? I thought I saw them up there. Is there a way to reveal those again? There we go. Okay. So 71% said yes, that there must be both an online and offline component in a post-COVID world. 6% no, and 23% no answer. Probably some of you just don't like yes or no questions. All right, fantastic. Let's move along to topic number 2. And Aaron's going to tee up another polling question, actually 2, I believe, polling questions related to topic number 2. While she does that, we're going to go ahead and dive in. And this is going to be for both John and Tania. So just the panel, I'll let you answer as you feel. But as we move on to topic number 2, we're going to start to get a little bit more granular now. So we've been thinking about that big picture. Okay, now how do we actually start to actualize this? And one of the themes that came up in our early discussions, which our attendees showed obvious interest in, was the idea of leveraging those resources which are close to home. So my question is this: as the future cadence of physical mobility remains uncertain, what resources are you aware of and exploring locally to help foster international education from within your own backyard? And then a second question to this, what feedback, if any, have you received from students regarding the value of those resources as an alternative to mobility?
So I'll take a stab at it. Well, obviously, we're in Washington, D.C., so we have a quite significant number of resources at our disposal, starting with the embassies. Um, we have the ability to contact people at embassies to come and speak, and we regularly have speakers come to campus at Howard, ambassadors and others to come and talk about their countries with our students, whatever um, issue or what have you is going on in their country. We often find embassy representatives on campus. That's not difficult for us to do. But that's not the only thing that there is for us to do in Washington, D.C. We have uh, restaurants from all over the world here. We have church communities with congregants from a variety of religious backgrounds, churches and other religious institutions from a variety of religious backgrounds from all over the world are also present here in Washington. But we also have cultural centers. I mean, DC and the surrounding communities in Virginia and Maryland have large immigrant communities. They're grocery stores. So trying to think of ways to take our students off campus and out into those communities is going to be one of the ways that we are going to address this. And the other thing I wanted to mention here is this past Tuesday, my team and I we were doing a professional development series for staff of the Office of the Provost. And we volunteered to provide a training session to our colleagues in the Office of the Provost around comprehensive internationalization, particularly as a staff member, how they can contribute to internationalization from their place, from their seat on campus. So I think this downtime that we have is actually an opportunity and another silver lining that we can use to take the time to bring our colleagues along with us on this journey towards comprehensive internationalization who might not see themselves or how their role fits in. So we did that. It was just an hour long session, and it has gotten really great feedback just in terms of bringing everybody onto the same page about what it is that we're even talking about when we talk about internationalization, and identifying with some colleagues exactly what their roles are that they may not have realized is a way for them to participate in internationalization.
Yeah, thank you, Tania. I'm happy to hear that that's well underway. John, before you start, just want to let the registrants know that, or the attendees know that there is another polling question up. So when it comes to cross-cultural resources, which exist within my own community or region, that may be able to help me support my own programs or initiatives, I am. So please go ahead and answer that at your leisure. I think there's time remaining for that. Thank you. Sorry. Back to you.
Oh. Well, I think that this maybe the silver lining in this, believe it or not, Bloomington, Indiana is not quite as international as Washington, D.C. Very close. But I do think that there is a little bit of an evening of the playing field that's happening right now, especially through social distancing measures. And so, to the question in terms of classroom experience, um, student expectations are somewhat tempered by the fact that much of what we do in the classrooms is going to be delivered through distance means. Um, and that being said, what we're able to do and what we are doing is relying heavily upon those networks that already exist, particularly within our faculties. So I think what AP did was what the College Board did rather with delivery of these master classes with AP was a great exemplar of what many universities in our peer group, what we're seeing them do is relying on expertise that exists outside of the campus, but is part of this academic network that's developed to make sure that we're presenting to students opportunities to interact with global audiences, with experts in various fields. Also relying on the fact that, um, we have to remember that just because mobility is at a pause right now, it only recently stopped. And so there is still a considerable amount of um, experiential uh, information for our returned study abroad students to share, for international faculty to share, and so forth. Um, and then back to the point about partnerships and collaborations with peer institutions, and keeping in mind that we can no longer define peer institutions as just part of the same athletic conference, or part of the same research category, or so forth. Peer institutions, especially within international education, are global. And so
Mm,
relying on those institutions that have similar ethos, similar pedagogies in place to really help with content, not only delivery, but content creation. Um, and then also looking, not forgetting the cultural component, the learning, the community building that happens outside of the classroom. And I think
mhm.
that is going to be key, especially in remote delivery, is to make sure that we're providing opportunities for those cultural exchanges, those kind of unfiltered student dialogues that happen within our learning communities, not necessarily within our classrooms. And so, working very closely with Campus Life partners, with us, we're working with IU Cinemas to do remote delivery with international film series and bringing in lecturers. We're doing noon concerts with students that run the gamut of musical types and genres. And so, so much of that is back to the point of meeting students where they are.
Yeah,
These are, young people. They're used to a phone in their face with YouTube. So this idea of remote delivery and consumption of substantive content to
yeah,
them is not only um, not foreign, but is in many ways expected. So
right.
we can also leverage those generational expectations to our advantage. And I think the onus is a little bit on us to catch up to where
Yeah,
the
so
student
there you happen to be preaching to the Apto choir, John. So
is.
yeah. And I really want to encourage, again, everyone who's attending to participate in the chat box. If there are granular ideas or even student centric or driven ideas that you've been hearing about, talking about, exploring, or developing for this type of remote content consumption, et cetera, please share that, or really anything, any resources in your backyard as well. And the results of the polling are in. And it looks like the majority of us are aware of these resources, but not necessarily connected or taking advantage of them. So this looks like a really great opportunity for us to start developing these relationships and leveraging them while we have downtime. So one of the things that I'll commit on behalf of Apto to do on the resource page is to create a list of those types of resources and topics, etc. Okay, fantastic. So moving on now to topic 3. We're going to spend a little bit more time on topic 3. And again, think of it as getting a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole. Topic 3 was actually the most important, most critical topic to everyone at hand, and that was the idea of international innovation. I love innovation, and being a linguist and language enthusiast, I took the time to see what Merriam-Webster had to say about the word innovate. So, Aaron, if you can tee up the next polling question, that definition is going to appear at the top of that question. But topic 3 is related to alternatives to going abroad. And John, thank you for the perfect segue into this, the idea of online and immersive training, digital content, digital storytelling. I think there are so many ways that, as you say, we can meet the students where they're at to give them an experience that they're looking for. For us at Apto, one of the big challenges that we're working to overcome is doing that for people where culture, language, or knowledge or insights, local insights might be a barrier, might exist as a barrier. And so the platform is there to specifically help to solve those equations. So this is a topic that's definitely very near and dear to my own heart. While Aaron is teeing up that polling question, Dr. Wilkerson, what changes to established practice in international education do you think must occur in order to innovate for success in our current environment?
Well, in the chat, you'll see Samuel makes a very good point that IU Bloomington does have great resources, and I've shared some of those. But I think kind of using that as a starting off point, what's important for an institution to know is what resources they have available. So a full kind of a more robust assessment of what what tools are already in the kit, I think is important. And that sounds simple. That sounds like a no-brainer, but those of us who work on university campuses understand the siloing that so often impedes a kind of comprehensive assessment of what is available.
Mm-hmm.
I think then helping particularly faculty to understand um, that those tools that are oftentimes the relationships that we're talking about, and so they're the de-siloing. I think that to go back to my earlier analogy, the further and wider we can build that bridge between the academy and the administration of an institution, which IU fortunately is doing quite well. Um, I think the better we are as a university to address nimbly the alternatives that are required. One of the things that really comes to mind is the importance of partnerships. We know that mindset data that's been put out by Edge Ventures, survey data that's available from Hart and Associates, indicate to us that SAT test takers or students, both international and domestic, expect to have a practical but also diverse, internationally diverse experience on campus. And that can really be drilled down into internships, practicum, problem solving based curriculum, things like that, from the classroom standpoint. But then how that curriculum is consumed um, and digested, I think it's gets to the point of this question, which is how do we innovate in that space, and how do we, aside from just giving it to the student, um, how do we ensure that it's being appropriately and significantly, I think, consumed. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I think comes to mind is, particularly in looking at that practical application piece of what it is that we're teaching, how do we leverage those public-private partnerships or institutional to NGO, organizational, what have you, partnerships within our learning environments? Because universities are not the only organizations that are socially distanced right now.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an opportunity very much present for students right now to work alongside some of these partner organizations or companies in which we're actively placing students, whether it's post graduation or through internship processes or so forth. There's an opportunity for students to learn within those organizations in the most unique of times
Absolutely.
that we've faced. And so I think that's one innovation. Um, this pandemic has blown away any doubt that we are a global people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea, I think, of leveraging those international networks, those international partnerships in
Yep.
particular, in ways that promote these content deliver or curriculum delivery methods, the pedagogy that we know works and that we know that students expect, leveraging technology to do that, I think is key to innovation.
Yeah.
That was a long answer, but I think all of it really gets back to the point of you have to know what tools you have in the kit, you have to know what you're missing, and then you have to be willing to pick them up and use them.
I love that. And it applies to everyone on this call, whether you're representing an institution of higher education in a traditional sense, a university, a community college, whatever it may be, or if you're with a cross-cultural exchange program, or, wherever international student success needs to be secured, needs to be shored up. This definitely applies. And I saw someone had requested that these resources will be shared. We'll be packaging these up along with the webinar recording to share with all of you. So let's move back to this polling question. To innovate means to make changes in something established, especially by introducing new methods, ideas, or products. When it comes to innovation in international education as a result of COVID-19, I see myself or my organization A, B, or C. So please take a moment to answer both questions 1 and 2. There are 2 questions in this particular poll. We'd love to get that information from you. Great. And Tania, let's bring you back. Let's bring you back for a reprise. Tania, this is a fun question that technology CEOs, learn in Salesmanship 101 to ask. If you had a magic wand, what product or service would exist to provide you a feasible and holistic alternative to sending your students abroad physically? And I'm picking on Tania in particular because I know that she is one of the most passionate people in the world about mobility. So I feel that this pain, she's feeling the pain of this more than ever. Tania?
You're right. This is such a hard question for me to wrap my brain around, because I absolutely refuse to accept a world in which travel is impossible. So I'm not even going to contemplate that. It will be temporarily halted for a period of time. However, it will return, and I will return strong, and we will get back to it. So I think we have to look, long term. But in the short term, in the immediate, what I think would be most helpful as we talk about resources, particularly, folks not necessarily in places like Washington, D.C., where there are some obvious resources available. And mind you, all of this, most of what I'm talking about is only really going to be really effective if students return to campus. So we might not be sending students abroad in the fall, and that's probably not going to happen very much. But hopefully some number of students will be on campus in the fall. And if and when that happens, then what would be helpful is kind of a directory of sorts that points us to the resources in our community, that with the understanding that that international education is not only the study abroad piece. I think a lot of schools start to think of that as they're like one and the same thing. That's the first thing. It's the easiest thing for people to think about. It is the most tangible thing for people to think about when they think about international education. And they don't really think about the other elements of it. So if in our office, we're going to be thinking about how to engage with these resources in and around Washington, D.C., it would be great to have a directory of cultural centers, community centers, churches, etc. Grocery store, I know there's lots of grocery stores out in Maryland and Virginia that cater to immigrant communities in those areas. So imagine a Saturday academy where we just spend the day taking our Howard University students, and if I had my way, some high school students, and we spend the day on a Saturday going to the grocery store and having lunch maybe in a restaurant nearby with members of the community that help us achieve some of the same things that we get to do when we are abroad, sitting down and having those intimate conversations about the politics in that country, or their experience here, and their perspective on the way things are happening in the United States from their perspective is equally as important. So just kind of like some directory that, recognizing that right now we're all going to be looking for these things, some sort of directory that says, oh, in Bloomington, these are some of the places where you can go, and also being.
Oh, Tania, we lost you. You're on mute.
Why did it mute? Okay, sorry. I'm almost done. To also to be mindful about not being voyeurs in those activities, and truly and respectfully and authentically engaging with the community that you're looking to be with and learn from in that space.
Yeah, finding your authentic self within global diversity, as opposed to um, you know allowing, or as you said, being overly voyeuristic. I like that. um, Dr. John, I wanted to see if you had a response to the magic wand question. I want to give you just a little bit of a prompt from one of our earlier conversations as well, because we're talking a lot about international student experience, which is obviously, critical. But we also discussed previously staff training, and preparing the staff for these times as well. So I didn't know. I don't want to overly prompt you, but if that's something that you feel inclined to talk about, or if you have other ideas, would love to hear from you.
Sure. Well, I think it's part of a broader conversation that has been happening within international education for years, which is that oftentimes the onus of internationalization, to Tania's point, has been placed on the backs of international students. And it's been really quantitative metrics that we've used to assess success in that area, counting passports, counting visa stamps. Um, that's not telling. I would argue I have worked with students directly who have spent 3 months in London on an internship, and they may as well have spent it in Delaware. So I think that the you can take a horse to water kind of adage holds true to some extent, but if the horse doesn't know how to drink to begin with, then what's the point? And that's where I think the cultural preparation comes into play. Also, to Tania's point, to move away from that voyeuristic um, approach towards internationalization into something more substantive for students. So in order to do that, I think the cross-cultural competencies need to be addressed, and that should really happen at all levels of the institution. It's something that we took up in our office. It was a gap that we saw, um, and not only a gap that we saw, there was a hunger for it across campus. And so we went through about a year-long process of doing in-depth cross-cultural competency assessment within our own staff in the Office of International Services, which is about 70 people, and then creating within that, within our office, a core group of trainers who are able to go and provide not only to faculty but also to staff these cultural competency trainings. And oftentimes, this is one of the benefits of being in higher education. We very rarely would encounter resistance towards that. It more often than not, it's academic units, it's staff units coming to us and asking for the training. But making sure that we're prepared appropriately, again, took that year-long investment. And so perhaps this is a good time to do that kind of work, where you're still creating, you're educating, you're still creating a very important foundation for intercultural awareness, for international dialogue. But it's more preparatory than it is experiential. Um, I think that once faculty, our experience has been that once faculty, and keeping in mind also at an institution like IU, I should shy away from faculty. It's more often instructors, more broadly, because we're, you know, oftentimes using teaching assistants and graduate students and so forth, who are a little bit less prepared or less experienced than tenure track faculty in that regard. But once they feel prepared and empowered to really understand the demographic composition of their class, but also, and this is really important, understand the cultural lens of what it is that they're teaching. That's when I think the internationalization of curriculum can really start to take place. And again, it gets back, I hate to keep going back to that analogy of the toolkit, but it does get back to a very important tool for our instructors to have and for our staff who are supporting the educational mission of the institution. Both arms need to have that tool.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. I'm going to go off script just a little bit. I know you guys can handle it, but one of the, I think, burning questions, maybe it's telepathy working, I'm not sure, but I know it's burning in my mind, is the drop in enrollment in the fall. And in your opinion, either this is directed to either, is there any way to turn that boat around, before the fall, or are we looking at taking this opportunity right now to have this conversation, to make these changes, to innovate, and in the hopes that it will lead to a more prosperous spring or fall of 2021?
Well, I can take a go at it. This is the one thing I didn't grab when I left the office was I keep a big crystal ball on my desk. So I can just show people when they kind of ask the impossible questions. Um, the barriers, I think, to mobility right now exist so far beyond our purview. They're unfortunately political, some of them, but oftentimes they're economic, they're health related. So there's so many players right now impacting what impediments or incentives, assistance will be in place for the fall. Um, as as simple as just visa procurement.
Right.
What has been encouraging, though, are three surveys that have been put out. One today by Institute of International Education, ISEF has done one, ACE has done one,
Mhm.
that have demonstrated that students still want to come. They still want the face-to-face experience. They want to come to our campuses. And that also tracks with mindset data put out by EduVentures. Um, but I think it's much too early to count on them. And
Yeah.
frankly, it's altered our enrollment projections, not only for international students, but also um, for domestic students as well. Uh, so if I had the crystal ball, we could all peer into it. But I think the best we can do is kind of day to day remain cognizant of what those potential barriers may be, and make sure that we're being as transparent in our decision making as possible with students and communicating that with
Yeah.
them. That's my take.
We have a lot of, I personally have been having a lot of really qualitative conversations with international students who participate as both guides and explorers in our platform. And I think one of our intentions is, and hopefully we'll follow up with this, but it is to work with some of you who are really responsible for that international student success, to make sure they also have a voice, and that we can understand, both sides of this equation. Because I personally am of the opinion that if there's going to be, some turning of that around, it's going to lie in as much as you referenced. Obviously, the ICI guidelines are, visa status is something we can't control, but in as much as we can control that conversation of international student success and experience, it goes directly to understanding their needs and hearing their voice. Tania, did you have thoughts to add to that?
I don't want to be repetitive. I think that he pretty much touched on all of the issues. Howard is in a little bit of a different situation, just because I think I think most colleges and universities in the US rely on international students because they tend to be full paying students. That is not the case at Howard University. A good number of our students receive some sort of funding um, from our institution or from elsewhere, but they are not full paying. Not all of them, some of them, but not all of them. Most of them are not, and so it makes it a little bit different. But it also means it'll probably be harder for them. In addition to the visa issues, it might be harder for them just to get back here, just generally speaking. But it also means some of them might not have left at all. So they might still just be here. So we're still trying to figure out who all stayed in the US and who all went home and then who all will be able to come back. And we all know no one knows the answer to that question yet because we just don't know these things.
Yeah. Tania, that's a very good point, though. The, the economics are so different from one university to the next about the importance of international students. And when you're composing your class for the fall, who's going to fill the seats? And so that, depending on the economic structures of many institutions, has informed how they're working wait lists in particular, whether or not they're keeping applications open longer, and so forth.
Thank you both. At this time, I'd like to open it up for live Q&A. Because there are a great number of attendees, if you could please submit any questions that you have or comments in the chat box publicly, and then we'll start to field those. And we'd love for you to go ahead and also, once we call on you or your question is submitted, we would love for you to turn on your audio, your video, and interact face to face, let your voice be heard. We also have one, while everyone is submitting those questions or comments, we have one final poll question related to urgent needs. There may be some of you on this call who still have urgent needs related to duty of care or related to international student experience or related to fiscal modeling, as we had alluded to. And if that is the case, we would love for you to get access to the resources that you need, and we'd like to be support for you in that. So please respond to those polling questions as well. And if there's anything specifically that you need, feel free to message myself or Erin privately. We would be happy to help to field those as well. So that being said, questions, comments, interaction. There are no wrong answers. All right, well, I want to make the most of our time. So I did have a couple of other questions that we didn't get to, which I'd be happy, Tania, for you and John to field while others think about this. Going back to the topic of international innovation and what we need to do, both in the short term, but also, Tania, potentially, to John's point, something that could provide or meet an expectation or a need of the students in general, ongoing, and help us to be able to transition more seamlessly offline and online in a post-COVID world. How do you see technologies, platforms, online products, and services supporting the innovation needed for successful continuation of international education? And more importantly, what problems must they solve in order to be effective long-term?
See, I am of the belief that there are some things that technology are just not going to be able to get you.
Sure.
That's the part that I struggle with online platforms. But I mean, I think there's going to have to be a future of some sort of hybridization of these experiences that, whether some of our providers are starting the semester abroad later, but starting the semester online virtually, and then transitioning into the physical movement of a person to another country. I think something like that is probably going to, at least for the short term, have to be something that we look more closely at. Also, I mean, again, some providers have already, many of them have already offered like study abroad, virtual study abroad. So our students would still have access to professors from foreign universities in classes with students from those same universities. They're just all online together as opposed to in the classroom, which obviously definitely has its benefits because you're learning from someone in a different way that you would learn from your professor at your home campus, but you're still sitting at home, which means you don't get to go to the grocery store in that country, and if they don't speak English in that country, figure out how to buy the things you need in that grocery store. It doesn't allow you to go to the cafe down the street, have a coffee, and just sit and observe life around you. And I don't think any of that can be captured virtually, not even in virtual reality. I mean, you can attempt, but at the end of the day, there has to be, I believe, that there has to be some movement that that makes its way back into this experience. But in the short term, I think we have to use technology and we have to be open to maximizing what it can do for us in this downtime.
Right. Thank you, Tania. John, what problems do you see that you think need to be solved?
To Umair's question in the chat, I think that also gets to me. I am of the same mind that technology can't answer everything. But I think that the expectation for this generation of learners is that technology can be used to enhance a personalized experience, not necessarily deliver it. And I think about when I started in the field and what an online class looked like, which was basically just here's the content, read it, put a couple of posts up, I'm not simplifying it. I actually think to do it well, a student had to be incredibly motivated and required quite a bit of gusto. Um, but I think that is probably the image of online learning, and I worry about that a little bit for many parents right now, where we know online and distance learning is, to Amir's point, much more a blended model with asynchronous and synchronous and interactive learning. Technology is advanced to a point to allow that, and students, I think, are ready for that. I don't think that they would be surprised. I think it's an expectation, but I do think that it's a model that is probably less familiar just in the zeitgeist when people say online learning. I think they're still thinking of a model that was probably 10 to 15 years ago. We see that the same way in our interactions with various CRM products and so forth with our prospective international students. We can use them to track and to make communications more efficient, but at the end of the day, that student wants to have a personalized interaction with someone at IU.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. We've got some questions now rolling in to the chat box. Yay for engagement and participation. So one of those questions comes from Anu Ibrahim, and he, let's see, Anu from the University of Tampa. So considering some of us are enrolled in programs with hybrid or face-to-face structure, and now it's completely switched to an online setting, how would you recommend we get schools to think about reducing the tuition, especially for private schools that increase fees each year? Fun question.
The conundrum there, I think, it gets to the opacity of educational expenses. And candidly, I think that higher ed has itself to blame for a lot of that. But those of us involved in it know that online delivery of a course is not less expensive than in-person delivery. Oftentimes it can be more expensive. So, but I think that it's not a message that's well communicated. I don't think it's Yeah, it's granular, and trying to explain that even in a 3-minute news clip is next to impossible. Tania, I don't know, what do you
I don't know. I mean, I'm not privy to these conversations, but I know that this conversation is taking place at my institution, at many others. This conversation about, you know, how or if they should reduce tuition costs. I don't think anybody, wants to do that, but obviously there are many students like Anna who think that the cost should be lowered. And I mean, there is merit to that because you are not getting that personal interaction with your fellow students, with your faculty, with your professors and others. So there's merit to that. But to your point, John, it's not necessarily cost saving. I'm in a PhD program in higher ed right now, and one of the things that we have talked about is the ability to have more students because you don't now have to all fit into one classroom because the classroom is now almost infinite, and you can. But then somebody's got to grade work, right? And so that's another factor that you could cram a lot more people into the space, but you still have to, you know, you have to grade that work. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch how this plays out in terms of the costs. I think this is an opportunity though for higher ed to rethink their structure, their financial structure, to make it more accessible to lots of people,
Mhm.
both in the U.S. and around the world.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Thank you, Tania. Mr. Holland had asked a question earlier, going back to the topic of uh, recreating authentic cultural experiences online using digital platforms. How then do you offer authentic cultural experiences via digital platforms? And it looks like there's been some conversation in the platform. Um, I want to just say, from my perspective, Tania and John, I completely agree. My I grew up with bilingual and bicultural, and I grew up when I was 14, 15. I went abroad for the first time, and then that continued. My first year of university was a study abroad experience. But one of the things that motivated me to found Apto was the concept that there were a whole lot of people out there in the world who didn't have access to those opportunities. And I felt very strongly that if we could create a two-way platform where and democratize the ability for sharing these experiences, that someone from Belarus could actually represent Belarus and represent the local culture, the local language, et cetera, that would give people a real opportunity to share that authentic, to experience something more authentic or cultural. Or Tania, to your point, to actually see from the first person perspective, going into that grocery store. And I think, one of the big questions that we have to solve for is how do we then, is really that hybridization, and how do we then take that on online and offline, moving back and forth in a way that is, that's really seamless and lends itself to, you know, a completely fun and intuitive experience for the end user and the student. And we're investigating that now. But what other thoughts do you have in terms of taking authentic cultural experiences online or digitizing those? Stumped.
I do think there's an important value to cohort building, and so maybe we start to look at models like that, because in a distance setting, to really create the relationships I think that are going to foster the trust you need to
Yeah.
have that kind of open dialogue in a classroom setting, perhaps a cohort model becomes more conducive to that. Um, I think that the question that's being posed, though, Tracy, really is a question that's long overdue. It's been lingering, but the answer is long overdue. And so perhaps what's happening is that this pandemic is forcing us to find those answers much more rapidly than
Sure,
we had previously liked.
sure. Yeah.
I had a interesting conversation yesterday with two of my former colleagues. I used to work for an organization, and we used to um, administer the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program, and they both still are somehow connected to it. And were telling me that the State Department is looking now. They have paused the International Visitor Leadership Program, which is a 3-week, 3-week professional exchange program. And what they're going to look at now is using some of the people who would travel with them that were employed by the State Department, who would facilitate their travel across the United States, use them instead in a virtual space to identify the mid-career professionals from another country and use those people that would have traveled with them as facilitators to allow the folks abroad to still engage with their professional counterparts in the US through this facilitator. And I know there's some facilitators on the call. I think incorporating some sort of guided facilitation because one of the things that I found so valuable from time abroad is really just sitting down and having conversations with people to just understand what is happening in their country, how is it impacting them, how is it impacting their family, etc.
Yeah.
And literally just having an hour or two just to really deep dive. And that's probably not going to happen organically just because you don't run into people on the internet. But if it was some sort of intentional, facilitated, guided conversation around, where everybody knows what we're talking about when we come to the table, but can go a little bit more deep into some of these things, that could be a way that we could maximize technology to try to get at some of the things that I found at least impactful while actually abroad.
Absolutely. Cross-cultural matchmaking, if you will, and facilitation. I love it. Thank you. Well, that actually brings us to the end of our time together. But this is not going to be the end of this journey. Please, do anticipate that we're going to keep this conversation going in the weeks and months to come. So in terms of next steps, if there is anything, any resource, a list of resources, ideas, assets, etc., that you are able to give, that might have come up, a theme that might have emerged from this conversation, please type in give into the chat box and then list those links or resources. Similarly, you can do GET. A GET is a request that you might have something you might like to receive. Also, you are welcome to email myself, Tracy, at aptoglobal.com, or Erin. Erin, you can put our emails or our LinkedIn's into the profile so that we can collect some of these assets, et cetera. And again, we'll be sending those out post-webinar along with the webinar recording. And we'll be adding things to our COVID-19 resources page. Also, please respond to our follow-up survey and stand by for those details regarding upcoming webinars. Again, Tania, Dr. Wilkerson, thank you so much for attending and for your candor and your ideas today, and for being willing to share the resources that you have. We really appreciate it very, very much. And again, thanks to Erin for facilitating this WebEx webinar today. We look forward to seeing you guys all again, I hope, very soon, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.